72-year-old Jack Mitchell stood outside the law office, his arthritic fingers clutching his foster mother's funeral program. His weathered face had the storm brewing inside. He came to grieve, not to fight. Inside the elegant office, Jack lowered himself slowly into a chair, his Vietnam wounded knee protesting. His threadbare navy suit hung loosely on his thin frame. Across the polished mahogany table sat his foster siblings, Luke and Paige, in designer clothes, barely acknowledging his presence. Mr. Ellison, the family lawyer, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses. Let's proceed with the reading of Eleanor Bennett's will. Jack listened carefully as Ellison detailed properties, accounts, and investments. The minutes ticked by, and his name never emerged. Just Luke and Paige, an even split between them. Nothing for Jack. Not a mention. "I'm sorry," Ellison said, closing the folder. "Your name simply isn't included." Jack's weathered hands remained steady. "That can't be right. She promised me." Luke smirked. "Promises aren't legally binding, old man." Something felt wrong. Eleanor wouldn't forget him. Not after everything. Jack was 12 when he first entered the Bennett home with a second-hand backpack and nightmares from his previous foster homes. He'd learned to stay quiet, to avoid attention, to expect disappointment. But Eleanor Bennett was different. She hadn't rushed to hug him like others. Instead, she knelt before him, looked into his eyes, and said, "You're safe here, Jack. You're home." And for 30 years, he believed her. The Bennett family lived in a tidy suburban house with a white picket fence and Sunday pancake breakfasts. Picture perfect on the outside. But behind closed doors, Luke and Paige never truly accepted Jack. It started with little things. Luke refusing to share toys, Paige making sure Jack knew which family photos predated his arrival. At school, they introduced him as the foster kid, even after the adoption papers were signed. Jack never complained. He worked harder, studied until his eyes ached, kept the house clean, learned to cook, to garden, to fix things. He believed if he was useful enough, they might eventually see him as family. Eleanor always did. She slipped cookies into his lunchbox. She sat on the edge of his bed, reading stories. She told him repeatedly that he mattered, that he was loved, that he would always have a place in her heart and in her will. "You don't have to worry," she'd say while folding laundry or watching sunset from the porch. "I've made sure you're taken care of, just like Luke and Paige. You're my son, too." Jack never asked for her money. What he needed was acknowledgement, reassurance that he hadn't imagined the decades of love. And now, sitting in this cold office, he felt the last threads of belonging slipping through his fingers. But veterans don't surrender easily, and something in Ellison's eyes, a flicker of discomfort, told Jack this battle wasn't over yet. After Eleanor fell ill, the family dynamic shifted dramatically. The house grew tense. Luke and Paige visited rarely, and when they did, they hovered around her belongings, whispering about the house, jewelry, and investments while their mother struggled to breathe in the next room. Jack stayed by her side, despite his aching knee and stiff back. Souvenirs from his military service. He read to her when her voice failed, brought her soup, helped her sit up, and combed her hair when her hands trembled too much to manage it herself. One night, when pain kept her awake, she made an unusual request. "Jack," she whispered, her voice thin but lucid, "could you install one of those small cameras in my study? Just for peace of mind. I think people are going through my things when I'm asleep." Jack didn't question her. 20 years in the Army had taught him to follow orders and stay vigilant. The next day, he installed a discreet camera near her bookshelf, hidden from casual observation. No lights, no sounds, just a quiet eye watching over a private space. She never mentioned again, and in the chaos of her declining health, it slipped from his mind. Jack's military career had shaped him profoundly. Enlisting at 18, he'd served in Vietnam, where an enemy grenade left shrapnel in his knee. Later deployments took him to conflicts around the world. He retired as a sergeant first class with chest full of medals he never displayed and memories he rarely shared. The discipline of Army life had taught him patience and observation. He noticed things others miss, like how Ellison's eyes darted nervously during a reading, or how Luke's hand trembled slightly when Jack mentioned Eleanor's promises. In the weeks before Eleanor's death, Jack had caught Luke and Paige in her study multiple times. They always had excuses, looking for photo albums, checking on insurance papers. But their hushed voices fell silent whenever he approached. At the funeral, Jack stood straight despite his pain, wearing his only suit, clean but frayed at the cuffs. He held the program carefully, nodding politely at condolences from strangers who barely made eye contact. Luke and Paige kept their distance, huddled with Ellison, exchanging whispers behind funeral programs. Jack watched them from across the room, his weathered face impassive, but his mind working like it had in combat zones, assessing threats, noting behaviors, preparing contingencies. As a young soldier, Jack learned that sometimes the enemy wasn't the one shooting at you, but the one smiling while reaching for your supplies. He'd survived because he paid attention, because he prepared. And now, as he observed Luke's smug expression and Ellison's averted gaze, those old instincts stirred again. Something wasn't right. The will, Eleanor's promises, the hushed conversations, the camera she'd requested. Pieces of a puzzle that didn't yet fit together. But Jack Mitchell had spent a lifetime solving puzzles under pressure. And he wasn't done yet. The sun was setting when Jack limped into his modest apartment, the gold and crimson light streaming through dusty blinds. He settled heavily into his worn armchair, knee throbbing from the day's stress. On the wall hung his single military photograph, Jack in uniform, decades younger, standing tall beside his unit. His mind circled back to the reading of the will, the way Ellison had shuffled those papers like a magician preparing a trick. The theatrical sigh. I regret to inform you, Eleanor updated her will privately several weeks before her passing. Updated? Privately? Those words nagged at him like an unsecured perimeter. Then it hit him, the camera. The small lens he'd installed in Eleanor's study at her request. Had it captured anything? Was it still recording to the cloud account he'd set up? With stiff fingers, Jack opened his laptop and logged into forgotten account. It had been weeks since Eleanor's death. Maybe nothing had been recorded. Maybe the battery had died. The screen flickered to life. Files appeared, organized by date. Jack clicked on the earliest, dated just 12 days before Eleanor's death. The grainy footage showed Eleanor alone in her study, seated at her desk. Though frail, her posture remained dignified. She looked directly at the camera, as if she knew someone would be watching. "This is for clarity," she said, her voice thin but determined. "My will states that everything I own should be divided equally among my 3 children. Yes, 3, Luke, Paige, and Jack." Jack's breath caught. He leaned closer to the screen. "I know some never fully accepted him," Eleanor continued, "but he is my son. He deserves as much as anyone else." She coughed into a handkerchief, then reached into her drawer and pulled out a folder. She held it up to the camera. "This is a signed will, notarized and witnessed. If anything happens to this document, know that I never changed my mind." The screen went dark for a second. Jack clicked on another file, time-stamped 4 days later. Mr. Ellison entered the room alone, moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. He opened the drawer Eleanor had shown to the camera, removed the same folder Jack had just seen, and replaced it with another, thicker, newer, different. The original went into his leather briefcase. Then Luke appeared in the doorway. "Done?" he asked. Ellison nodded. "They won't question it." Jack paused the video. For a long moment, he sat motionless in the blue glow of the screen. There was no outburst, no dramatic reaction, just a deadly calm he'd cultivated through decades of military discipline. He clicked download, transferred the footage to a flash drive, then closed the laptop. Slowly, he reached for his cane and jacket. 20 years in the military had taught Jack many things. How to assess threats, how to navigate hostile territory, and most importantly, how to plan a counterattack. Tomorrow would be interesting. Mr. Ellison looked up from his desk the next morning, clearly startled to see Jack Mitchell standing in his doorway. The veteran's posture was straighter today, his eyes sharper. Despite his age and worn clothing, something in his bearing made Ellison straighten his tie nervously. "Mr. Mitchell, I wasn't expecting you. Do you have an appointment?" Jack walked forward, slowly but purposefully, each step with his cane deliberate on the expensive carpet. Without a word, he placed a small flash drive on the polished desk. "What's this?" Ellison asked, not reaching for it. "Clarity," Jack replied, his voice calm, almost gentle. Ellison's hand moved toward the drive, but Jack raised his weathered palm to stop him. "Before you watch that, I suggest you think very carefully about the last time you were in Eleanor's study." Ellison froze. For a man who prided himself on composure, the shift in his eyes said everything. His mouth opened, then closed again without sound. Jack leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "She asked me to install a camera just for peace of mind," she said. Turns out she was right to worry. Ellison swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing visibly beneath his expensive collar. "I suggest you correct the will immediately, before I send copies of that footage to the Bar Association, the police, and every news outlet in the city." Silence filled the room. Then Ellison nodded, the movement stiff and robotic. He looked like a man watching his career crumble before his eyes. Jack didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply turned around and walked out, the tap of his cane marking his exit. 3 days later, the Bennett family reconvened in Ellison's conference room. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, highlighting dust motes in the air. Luke lounged his chair, arms crossed, already smirking. Paige barely glanced at Jack, scrolling through her phone with practiced indifference. "Why are we here again?" Luke demanded. "We already settled this." Jack stood quietly at the far end of the table, still in his threadbare suit, but somehow taller, more present. "I have something to show you," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had commanded troops. Before Ellison could object, Jack connected the flash drive to the television mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life, showing Eleanor Bennett, their mother, speaking directly to the camera with a voice that, though soft, filled the room with its resolve. "My will states that everything I own should be divided equally among my 3 children." Gasps rippled through the room. Paige dropped her phone. Luke sat forward, mouth slightly open. Ellison turned pale. The video continued. Eleanor holding up the will, naming Jack specifically. Then the second clip played, Ellison entering, switching documents, and finally Luke appearing, asking, "Done?" The room went ice cold. "You stole my mother's voice," Jack said evenly. "You tried to erase me from her life, from her legacy." The door opened. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the room, called by the firm's paralegal who had been watching the footage unfold. "Mr. Ellison?" one asked. The lawyer's voice cracked. This is a misunderstanding." But no one was listening anymore. The seasons turned. Autumn painted the trees gold and crimson across the small town. The Bennett house remained, though quieter now. Its secrets finally dragged into the light. Jack hadn't returned there since that day at the lawyer's office. He didn't need to. Closure wasn't a place. It was a realization that some battles were worth fighting, especially when they weren't just for yourself. He stood now beneath the warm sun outside a small brick building nestled between a church and a community center. On the glass door was a hand-painted sign, Mitchell Veterans Justice Fund. Inside were no mahogany desks or leather chairs, just a clean, practical space with 2 donated computers and walls lined with resources. Legal guides, veterans' rights handbooks, benefits information. Things many aging veterans never knew they were entitled to. Jack walked in, nodding to the young woman at the front desk, a recent law school graduate whose father had served in Iraq. "Anyone come in today?" he asked. She smiled. "An older veteran from West Side. Says his landlord's trying to evict him despite his protected status. Wants to know his options." Jack nodded slowly. That story was all too familiar. This was why he'd used his portion of Eleanor's estate to establish this place. Not to get even, not to prove something to the family that never fully accepted him, but to ensure other veterans wouldn't face similar injustices alone. The aftermath of the will scandal had been swift. Ellison's law license was suspended pending an investigation. Criminal charges for fraud and elder abuse were filed. The original will was reinstated. Luke had disappeared from town entirely. Paige sent a letter months later. Short, awkward, apologetic. Jack hadn't replied, not because he was bitter, but because he didn't need to explain his existence anymore. Eleanor had already done that with her voice, her will, and her belief in him when others had failed. Now her legacy lived through every document he reviewed, every injustice he helped correct, every voiceless veteran who walked through his door seeking help. As the sun shifted in the sky, Jack leaned against the doorframe, watching the quiet street. A young military family walked by. A man in uniform, his wife, and their small daughter. The little girl paused to read the sign on the glass. Mitchell Veterans Justice. She sounded out carefully. Her father smiled. That place helps veterans who don't know how to fight for what's rightfully theirs. The little girl looked up at Jack with curious eyes, then waved shyly before rejoining her parents. Jack stood still, feeling a lump rise in his throat. This was belonging, not being accepted because of blood, but being remembered because of impact. In a world that had once tried to tell him he didn't matter, Jack had answered the only way that mattered, not with noise, but with purpose. Because justice doesn't need permission. It just needs someone brave enough to stand for it. Someone who understands that respect for veterans isn't just about parades, but about ensuring they're never forgotten when it matters most. If you've witnessed veterans fighting for the respect they deserve, share your thoughts in the comments. Respect is earned through service. How do you think we should honor it?